I never thought the person I carried for 9 months, the boy whose every scraped knee I kissed and every nightmare I chased away, would look me in the eye and tell me I was a financial burden. Yet there I was, standing in the kitchen I had scrubbed for 30 years, listening to my son tell me he didn't want to feed an extra mouth anymore. He didn't just say it in a moment of heat. He had it all planned out, even going so far as to find me a job as a live-in caretaker for an elderly man across the state, just so I'd be out of his hair and off his payroll. I smiled at him, I nodded, and I told him I'd go. But what he didn't realize was that the extra mouth he was so worried about was the only thing keeping his entire world from crumbling into dust. Before I get into the details of how I turned his cruel plan into the biggest mistake of his life, I have to ask you, if your own child treated you like a disposable piece of furniture, would you walk away quietly, or would you make sure they understood exactly what they were losing? To understand how we got to that cold morning in the kitchen, you have to understand the life I lived for my son Leo. When my husband Arthur passed away 15 years ago, he left us with a modest life, a house that was paid off, a small life insurance policy, and a sense of security. I poured every cent of that insurance money into Leo's education. I worked 2 jobs, one at a local diner and another cleaning offices at night, just to make sure he could go to the best university and start his life without the crushing weight of student loans. I remember coming home at 3 a.m. with my back aching and my hands smelling like industrial bleach, just to look at his sleeping face and tell myself it was all worth it. I stayed in that old family house, keeping it pristine, waiting for the day he'd find his footing. When Leo got married to Sarah, they moved in with me temporarily, to save for a down payment on their own place. That was 5 years ago. Slowly the dynamic shifted. It wasn't my house anymore. It was theirs, and I was just the live-in maid who didn't get a paycheck. I did the laundry, I cooked the meals, I maintained the garden, and I even paid the property taxes and utilities out of my small Social Security check. I didn't mind, because I thought I was helping my son build a legacy. I spent my weekends weeding the flower beds Arthur had planted, thinking I was preserving a home for Leo's future children. But over the last year, something changed. Leo got a promotion to a senior management role, and Sarah started hanging out with a more upscale crowd, people who wore designer labels and spent their weekends at country clubs. Suddenly, having an aging mother in the house didn't fit their aesthetic. They started complaining about the clutter in my room, which consisted of photos of Leo's father, old mementos from his childhood, and the rocking chair I used when Leo was a baby. Sarah began making passive-aggressive comments about the smell of old people in the hallway. Then came the comments about the grocery bill. Sarah would sigh loudly when she saw I'd bought a specific brand of tea or a loaf of bread she didn't like. Even though I paid for those things with my own meager money, she started hiding the good snacks in her bedroom and telling me that the pantry was getting overcrowded. I felt like a ghost in my own hallways, walking on eggshells just to avoid a lecture about how I was occupying too much space. Then 3 weeks ago, they sat me down at the dining table with a folder. This was the table where I used to help Leo with his math homework, the table where we shared Christmas dinners. Leo wouldn't look me in the eye at first. He kept fidgeting with his expensive watch. Sarah was staring at me with this plastic, forced pity, the kind you give to a stray dog you're about to drop at a shelter. Leo finally spoke up and said that things were getting tight, that they wanted to start a family, and they needed my room for a nursery. He told me he'd done me a huge favor, and talked to an old friend who managed a private estate. They needed a live-in helper for an old man who was difficult to deal with, but the pay was decent and I'd have a bed. "I just don't want to feed an extra mouth, Mom," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "You're still young enough to work, and it's time you stood on your own 2 feet instead of relying on us for everything." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. He was living in a house I paid for, eating food I cooked, and yet he was telling me to stand on my own feet. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that I can't even describe. It wasn't just sadness. It was a profound realization that the boy I raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw his mother as a line item on a budget. I looked at the folder, saw the job description for a domestic assistant, and realized it was basically a position for a servant. I did something they didn't expect. I smiled. I told them that if that's how they felt, I wouldn't want to be a burden for a second longer. I told them I'd take the job and leave by the end of the week. Sarah looked relieved, almost giddy, and already started measuring my room for new wallpaper before I even stood up from the table. Leo finally looked up, looking more annoyed that I hadn't put up a fight. He probably wanted me to beg or cry so he could feel powerful and magnanimous in allowing me to stay for a few more weeks. But I had a secret. You see, when Arthur died, the house wasn't just left to us. Arthur was a smart man, and he knew that sometimes people change when money is involved. The house was in a very specific irrevocable trust that I controlled entirely as the primary trustee until my death, at which point it would pass to Leo, but only if the house was still in the trust. More importantly, the savings account Leo thought was his college fund leftovers was actually a managed investment account Arthur had set up for me that had grown significantly over 15 years. I had been living frugally, letting them believe I was penniless, just to keep their lives easy and see if they would care for me out of love. I had over $500,000 in that account, plus the full value of the house, which had skyrocketed in this neighborhood. The car Leo drove? It was technically registered to the trust. Even the down payment they were supposedly saving was only possible because they weren't paying a dime in rent or utilities. I want you to really think about this for a second. Imagine you've given everything to someone, your health, your youth, and your every penny, and the moment they feel they don't need you, they throw you away like trash. Before I tell you what I did on my moving day and how I responded to Leo's extra mouth comment, I want you to pause right now and go to the comments. What would you do? Would you sign the house over and leave just to keep the peace? Or would you show them who really holds the keys to their comfortable lifestyle? I really want to know if you think I was being too harsh, or if they got exactly what was coming to them. Please, tell me your honest thoughts before I reveal the rest of this mess. On the morning I was supposed to leave for this job, Leo found me. I didn't pack much. I spent the last 3 nights quietly packing my most precious belongings and moving them to a storage unit while they were asleep. I didn't want any of my history left in that house for Sarah to throw in the dumpster. On my final morning, Leo and Sarah were already talking about which paint colors they wanted for the nursery and how they were going to tear out my rose garden to put in a modern patio. As I stood by the front door with my single suitcase, Leo didn't even look up from his phone. He handed me a bus ticket. Not an Uber, not a ride in the car I paid for, but a bus ticket. He didn't even offer to drive me to the estate, saying he had an important meeting he couldn't miss. I took the ticket, thanked him with a steady voice, and then I handed him a heavy legal envelope. I told him it was a parting gift, to help him with the house now that I wouldn't be there to manage the bills. He smirked, probably thinking it was a small check or a list of grocery stores. I walked out, got into a black car that he didn't know I had hired, and drove straight to a lovely assisted living boutique community I had scouted months ago. A place that looked like a 5-star resort, which I could easily afford for the rest of my life. Inside that envelope wasn't a check. It was a formal eviction notice, a notice of termination of the trust's residential allowance, and a copy of the trust agreement highlighting the clause that allowed the trustee to liquidate the property if the beneficiary failed to provide adequate familial support. Since they wanted me to stand on my own 2 feet, and didn't want to feed an extra mouth, I decided they should experience that independence as well. I had officially put the house on the market that morning, and because it was in a prime location, I already had 3 cash offers. The extra mouth they refused to feed was the one that owned the roof over their heads. But I didn't stop there. I also included a bill for the last 5 years of property taxes, utilities, and domestic services I had provided, which I had meticulously documented with receipts and logs. I informed them that the car, also owned by the trust, needed to be returned to a specific dealership by 5 p.m. that day, or it would be reported as stolen. Within 2 hours, my phone started exploding. I was sitting on my new balcony, sipping a glass of high-end wine, when the first call came in. Leo was screaming into my voicemail, his voice cracking with rage and panic. He called me heartless, a traitor, and asked how I could do this to my own son. He actually had the nerve to say, "Mom, you're making us homeless. Think about your future grandkids." Sarah was crying in the background, wailing about their reputation, and how they would explain this to their country club friends. She even tried to call me herself, leaving a sugary sweet message pretending the whole extra mouth thing was just a big misunderstanding. I didn't answer. I didn't respond to the texts. I simply blocked their numbers and called my lawyer to handle the rest of the communication. I spent the next few months traveling: Paris, Rome, the Greek Isles, visiting the places Arthur and I had always talked about but never went to because we were too busy saving for Leo's future. I sold the house for nearly $1 million to a lovely young couple who actually appreciated the vintage molding and promised to take care of Arthur's rose garden. I heard through the grapevine that the day of the eviction was a spectacle. Leo and Sarah had to move their expensive furniture into a storage unit they couldn't afford because they had no place to go. Since they hadn't actually saved a down payment, having spent it all on luxury clothes and dinners to impress their friends, they realized very quickly that Leo's promotion salary didn't go very far when you actually have to pay market rate rent and buy your own groceries. They ended up in a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, right next to a highway. No more granite countertops, no more rose gardens, and certainly no more upscale parties. Leo reached out through a cousin months later, sounding broken and humbled. He apologized and said he didn't mean it that way, claiming he was just stressed at work. But I knew the truth. He meant every word until he realized the person he was insulting was the person holding the purse strings. He didn't want to feed an extra mouth, so I made sure he only had to worry about his own. He wanted me to stand on my own 2 feet, and in doing so, I realized just how much faster I could run without him weighing me down. I haven't seen him in a year, and honestly, the peace and quiet is the best gift I've ever given myself. The moral of this story is simple. Never mistake someone's kindness for weakness, and never bite the hand that feeds you, especially if that hand belongs to the mother who sacrificed her life to give you one. Respect isn't something you give only when it's convenient or when you think you're getting something out of it. It's the foundation of any family, and once you break that, you might find yourself out in the cold. It takes a lifetime to build a home, and only one sentence to lose it. If you think I did the right thing by teaching my son a lesson in humility, and showing him that a mother's love isn't a debt to be managed, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and tells me you want more stories like this. And if you've ever dealt with an ungrateful family member who thought they could walk all over you, share your story in the comments. I read every single one of them, and we can all support each other here. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, revenge, and life lessons. I'll see you all in the next story.